What's up, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy Dog Waters, and we're about to get rolling. So let's start here, so people understand. I got to do the build up for Operation Black Sun. I just don't just be dropping this level of content just drop it in your lap, because it's way too complicated and sophisticated for me just to drop a video like it's 100 dog man encounters or 13 scary ghost encounters. This is some next level shit. So here's what's about to happen. We're going to go through the history of this. We're going to go ahead and we're going to go all the way back to Alaskan expedition. We're coming through the winged ones, and then we're going into Lion Man of Judah. In between the winged ones and Lion Man of Judah, if I can find the Ben file, which I haven't been able to find it, of the original Ben story that was put out, his background story, I'm going to put that out. I'm going to give you guys the scissors story. I'm going to give you guys a couple other stories that are very critical and crucial for you to understand what happens in Operation Black Sun. Then I'm going to give you guys Operation Black Sun. And all I can tell you is, dude, just buckle your fucking seatbelt. You know what I'm saying? For those of you who are new to the Dark Waters channel, of course, your question is going to be, is this real? Did he make this up? Dude, anybody who knows me knows that I'm not the type of person sitting around for fucking hours making up shit like this. You can't make this kind of shit up. But if you're new, you need to listen to it all, like in connected, so you can understand what's going on. So to my new people, welcome to the family. You are about to benefit from all the people who came before you, their support, their patience, their love, their kindness. You're about to benefit and get one of the most epic freaking stories you've ever heard. And I put this up against anything. This true story, which is true, it's not no creepypasta. I put it up against anything. You don't know how many people approach me about movie rights to this, and we want to do a movie, and we don't, sit your ass down somewhere. I'm not doing that. Sit your ass down in the corner. So, guys, let's get the ball rolling. Let's get the show on the road. Peace.
Oh, 1500 hours, August 2010. We're flying at 20,000 feet. Our team, which is led by my best friend Steve and I, are on our way to Ruby, Alaska in search of a monster known to many as Bigfoot, the descendants of an unholy union between fallen angels and the daughters of men. Modern day cannibalistic giants that grow to 12 feet tall and weigh over 1,000 pounds. These creatures are fast, aggressive, and very territorial. They are known to rip a man apart limb from limb and devour him, as foretold by the Book of Giants. My name is Roger, and I've been called many things. To some, I'm a crazy man. To others, a hero. But in reality, what I am and what we do is hunt monsters. Our objective is to hunt and kill the clan north of Ruby, Alaska, and cleanse the earth of these vile creatures. This story is the tale of our expedition. The events detailed here are all true. Many of you think you know what Bigfoot is, but you don't. You are ignorant to the reality of what it is that you face, and you assume that you're safe. I can assure you that the world is full of dangerous monsters. And if you actually knew the truth, you will realize that our world holds many terrifying creatures. Just the sight of these creatures causes the hearts of the best men to falter. On a plane, the 5,000-mile flight to Alaska was just as I expected it to be, full of jokes and laughter. After all, the crew we had was a mixed bag of sociopaths, psychopaths, and one techie. I'm not sure about the company you keep in your life, but these guys, they're a handful. Now for the crew. Steve and I go back, way back to the 5th grade. I'll never forget the day I first met him. It was cold as shit. And in the infinite wisdom of St. Rita's private school, they decided to let the kids out on the yard for recess. Now don't let the name fool you. St. Rita's was a private school, but it was kind of rough. To this day, I don't understand why Steve's father insisted he attended the school anyway. I guess you can say his father believed in tough love. As for Steve's family, now they're rich. And I'm not talking about bullshit.com stock market rich. I'm talking about oil money rich. The type of rich no one in his family really had to work for the next 7 generations. But his dad was old school. He drove a beat up pickup truck and made sure he counted every penny. Steve's older brother worked at McDonald's his entire senior year at high school. Anyway, back to the story. That day, Steve was on the yard, surrounded by some of the less desirable kids in the 6th and 7th grade. And true to his MO, he didn't know when to back down, and he damn sure didn't know when to shut up. I couldn't stand by and watch them just beat him up, so I interceded, trying to help out, only to take that ass whooping with him. Ever since that day, Steve and I have been best friends. And man, what friends have we been? Our friendship has taken us all around the world. And we got into some crazy shit. I'm talking about drunken fist fights on the beach in Ibiza, chased by tigers in India, arrested in Moroccan whorehouses. The list goes on and on and on. The sheer and utter delight and danger that we have experienced as friends is just incomprehensible. It was all fun and games until one evening in the jungles of Venezuela, we ran into something that should not have existed. This creature had the body and a face of a woman, with wings like a bat. It ruined our expedition and killed 50% of our crew. From that day on, we decided to hunt and kill these abominations wherever we may find them. Which brings me to the next member of our crew. It was on an expedition to Africa in search of the lion of Judah that we found him clinging to his last breath. Vital was 18 years old when we discovered him, hidden inside of a hollowed out tree stump, clutching his empty AK-47. He was a fierce child soldier. Vital's parents were killed when he was 10 years old. His mother brutally raped and his father killed before his eyes. So for the next 8 years, he was forced to fight and kill indiscriminately. During that time frame, he became one of the most feared soldiers on the battlefield. So feared that the other generals decided that it was better to take his life than let him take over their army. So one night, the general sent 30 soldiers to kill him. By morning, 30 men lay there dead, and Vital was gravely injured. When Steve and I stumbled upon him in the jungles, he was barely clinging to life. And from that day on, Vital has been with us. I witnessed him kill a full-grown lion with nothing but a 45 and a machete. He's a 6'8" African badass with a serious attitude problem, but we love him to death. Also with us is Charlie. He's pretty new to the team. Graduated from MIT with a degree in information technology, then went on to work to Microsoft. He was there for 2 years before he got caught hacking. You know, Charlie really gives me the creeps. You know, he reminds me of one of those guys on To Catch a Predator. Except for Charlie's the kind of guy that'll hack your baby monitor and watch your wife breastfeed. He's sick. I repeatedly told Steve that I don't care for him and I don't even want him around. And truthfully, I hope on this trip, Bigfoot shoves a keyboard right up his ass. That way I don't have to be bothered with him anymore. He serves as our tech guy, setting up cameras and stuff like that. The geeky stuff that allows us to see what's coming to get us before it gets us. As for the rest of the crew, they're all ex-military contractors. Karate Kid, who's my boy, I love him to death. He's our point man, and he looks just like Ralph Macchio. Chef, who's our cook, and deadly with anything with a sharp point on it. Scissors, who got his name torturing jihadis in the Middle East. And last but not least, Gentle Ben. I think this son of a bitch is part Sasquatch himself. 6'11", 275 pounds of lean muscle. Ben. Now Ben is extremely fast and agile for his size. And the worst thing about Ben is he's unstable. And he's triggered by the least of things. Just last year, we're in Saudi Arabia at one of the markets. And this street vendor decides to start laying into his wife. I mean, beating her up. Foot to mouth type ass whooping. It looked like some WWE shit going on in the middle of the street. Steve and I just kept walking. It wasn't any of our business. But no, not Ben. Ben had to get involved. For some reason, this stranger beating his wife triggered him. And I don't know what it was. Maybe his father used to beat his mother's ass when he was a kid and he would witness it. But oh my God, he walks up to this man and with one hammer fist, bam, smashes him on the top of the head. He falls to the ground and he proceeds to start kicking him over and over and over again. In about 20 seconds, it's all over. But there's a crowd surrounding us all at this point in time. Ben looks into the crowd with this look on his face, like I dare any one of you to do something. and not one person moved. Yeah, Ben is our boy, but Ben is unstable, and he's got problems. It was this crew of men that landed in the Beechcraft 450 at a tiny airport in Ruby, Alaska. And after a long process of unloading our gear, we all headed up the Mezzanine River in a few small motorized boats. Now you need to understand something. On the Mezzanine River, they don't really like you using motorized boats. It's more of a recreational type river. You find people kayaking and things of that nature. But we didn't have time for kayaks. The area we were headed to was 15 miles upriver, and we would have to travel 3 to 5 miles north into the wood lines to reach the area we knew the creatures lived in. The ride upriver was slow and rather uneventful. You know, we saw a few grizzly bears, a moose here and there, some oversized beavers, but nothing really exciting. One thing that did kind of pique my interest was for a while a grizzly bear decided to run along the banks following us upriver. After a few hundred yards, he decided we would not worth his effort, so he ran back off into the woods. When we reached the area marked on the GPS, stopped, pulled our boats out of the water, and headed into the woods. Now, this terrain was like nothing I'd ever really seen before. The Sika spruce trees went on for miles. And the only good news was that the woods in this area wasn't really dense, so you had a good line of sight and good vision all around you. With our equipment gathered, we embarked on a hike towards the base of the mountain range. Now, I've been all over the world and been in some creepy places, but there was really nothing quite like this. The feeling that this place gave you was just being so isolated. It was different. And from the minute we headed into the woods, I had the feeling that something was watching me. Even Ben commented that something had eyes on us. He could feel it. The spot we had picked to camp for the night was about 1.5 miles away from where we suspected that the Bigfoot's territory was. So we got to work, cutting down trees and making a sufficient base camp. Charlie and Kid ventured out to set up night vision cameras and perimeter sensors, while the rest of us set up tents and solar power supplies and the rest of the equipment. By nightfall, we had finished our prep and were set up. Roger rested in his tent, while the rest of us were just sitting around telling stories. Somehow, during the time we were setting up, Chef had ventured out and killed one of those oversized beavers, and by the time he finished with it and added some rice, you'd have thought we were eating at Applebee's. So around 10 o'clock, just when we were all about to settle down to rest, one of the perimeter alarms on the north side was triggered. Of course, everyone huddled around the little table that Charlie had set up as a monitoring station, and we discovered 2 grizzly bears moving silently through the woods. Now that is weird. Grizzlies are normally a solitary animal. You rarely see 2 of them together, ever. Just then, the 2 animals stopped and began to sniff the air with the nose pointed upwards and to the north. Then a larger one stood up on his hind legs and began to growl and roar. This sound echoed through the night air. And then the second one did the same thing. For a moment, they just stood there, staring into the darkness. Then came this vocalization like nothing I had ever heard. One of the bears took off running full speed out of the view of the camera. And the other one again stood up on his hind legs and growled. Next, we heard what sounded like a tornado coming down the mountainside, breaking trees, rocks falling, and this yelling that was almost deafening. This grizzly bear took off south, heading straight for our camp, and within 45 seconds, a 400-pound grizzly bear was bolting through our campsite and headed southward towards the river. Ben, Kid, and Chef grabbed their weapons, preparing for whatever it was that was chasing it, but the sound stopped. Looking back on it, I believe that this is how they first came to know exactly where our campsite was. Later, this would be a major problem, and one that will almost cost me my life. The following morning, at dawn, we all ventured northwards towards the area where we had heard the sounds coming from. Now, the terrain in this area was quite different and sloped steeply uphill to the point that each step was difficult. Kid, who was on point, radioed back to us that he had found some large broken trees up ahead. Then a few minutes later, he said something that let us all know we had reached these creatures' territory. What in the name of Jesus? He sounded frantic when he told us about the huge trees driven into the ground upside down with their roots exposed. Some were older, but others were fresh and had just been placed. By the time we reached Kid, I eyed with his finger on the trigger. This might not be such a good look for us. Whatever did this had to be huge, Kid said. Steve looked unfazed as he inspected the tree, and he signaled for us to venture further beyond what clearly was some type of boundary line. As we moved deeper into the wood lines, it became evident and clear that we had reached some type of plateau. And I couldn't help but feeling like I was invading some type of foreign soil. The woods seemed completely still. Not just silent, but still. Almost as if the trees themselves was anticipating something happening. We didn't have to wait for long to discover what it was. Ben, who was covering our six, shouted, "Contact!" Then let loose from his weapon. Then it went silent and he shouted, "Target hit!" Rushing towards the direction in which he fired, we discovered blood splatter and hair. This thing had to be fast. It took us less than a minute to get to the very spot he was shooting at. From there, Kid fanned out looking for a blood trail and any signs where it went. Only to return 5 minutes later saying he had lost the trail. It was like the creature had just disappeared. For the next 2 hours, we explored every square inch of that plateau and found all kinds of signs that this was indeed their area. Broken tree limbs that they use as markers. Huge structures made of broken trees. This was a jackpot. Everything was here except for the clan. Now the climb to move further north was way too steep. So we decided to head back down towards our campsite. After what happened today, everyone knew there would no longer be a need for us to go out looking for these things. They were going to come to us. And when we arrived back at the campsite, Charlie was already working to move his motion sensors out 200 yards away from the camp. He said after hearing all the gunfire in the distance, he knew tonight we were in for some shit. And boy, was he right. No sooner than the sunset, we began to hear them from every direction. It was this whooping and then this screaming, almost as if they were calling out to each other over a long distance, a mile. Then around 10 p.m. that night, everything went silent. Steve looked at Ben and Chef and said, "Hey, get ready. I think they're coming in for us." Charlie had this small drone that he flew up into the air just to inspect the area to see what was surrounding the perimeter. And from this bird's eye view, we saw 15 heat signatures all around us. We were surrounded on all angles. But for some reason, they were staying beyond our perimeter. We didn't know what they were going to do next, but I knew one thing: we weren't going out to them. They were going to have to come to us. 10 minutes later, the northern perimeter alarm went off. Then seconds after that, the southern perimeter alarm went off. Then the east and the west perimeter alarms went off. They were moving in. You could feel the ground rumbling as these things ran in at us. They would run just beyond the area of the lights, almost as if they were running zigzag patterns crossing around us. This full speed running back and forth, left and right, north, south, east, and west went on for the next 15 minutes. I think they were checking our defenses for some type of weakness. Then it started. A full-size tree came flying in over our heads, hitting one of our lights and knocking it down. Chef and Kid, who were covering the south, began to fire their weapons. Steve and I began to fire. Ben covered the east while Sisters covered the west. Back to back, with our backs turned to each other, we fired round after round and clip after clip. Charlie huddled in the middle of us with his computer trying to find out what was going on. And he kept calling, "Incoming from the north! Incoming from the south! Incoming from the east!" After what felt like an hour of pure madness, Ben got completely and totally enraged. And I saw him out of the corner of my eye going to his case and grabbing his AA-12 shotgun. Once he began shooting that shotgun, all activity ceased. And high above us, from the area of that same plateau, we heard a scream so loud and so powerful that I knew that this was just a test. The real danger was whatever that thing was at the top of the plateau, screaming and giving orders to these creatures. That we would discover the very next night. The following morning, camp was a mess. 3 out of our 4 lights were destroyed, and they had thrown full-grown trees at us. Charlie started his bitching and moaning about not being safe. He wanted to leave. The little wussy acted like he had a choice in the matter. Steve was clearly perturbed as he walked around the perimeter. I hit 3 of them in the chest multiple times, he said. So did I, said Ben. I hit 2 of them with the AA-12. What was most confusing was that there was no bodies. Vital, who I only saw one time during a firefight, was not in the campsite. When Steve and I realized this, instant panic set in, and we began to look around for any signs of where he might have gone to. Fanning out in all directions, we moved around searching for him. And just as Steve and I began to assume the worst, he signaled us from high in a tree. Now somehow, during the firefight, he managed to flank these creatures and get well behind them. Vital went on to tell us that he observed them during the fight, that these animals carried their wounded and dead off when they left. He also told us that when they left, they scattered in all directions. Vital believed that this was not just one clan, but it was 4 clans that we were up against. I have to admit, I was impressed. How the hell did he pull this off? And for the first time, I began to think that we had bit off way more than we could chew. A huge part of me wanted to leave, and Vital even said it. This is a fight we cannot win. But I knew Steve, and we weren't going anywhere. When we returned to camp with Vital, there was this synchronized exhale and a brief moment of relief. But as soon as Charlie started yapping about wanting to leave, the shit hit the fan. Steve grabbed him by the back of the neck, pulling him close and whispered, I didn't hire you for your fucking opinion or cowardice. Now get your ass moving and expand our perimeter. To be honest, the overall consensus was that we needed to leave. And Steve knew it. I mean, we fucked with some terrible shit in our time. But 3 to 4 clans of Bigfoots? That was a bit too much. And the intel that we gathered only told us about one violent clan. We didn't even come prepared to deal with more than one clan. And last night, we ran through 35% of our munitions. If they attacked us 2 more times, we were fucked. So I pulled Steve to the side while everybody was cleaning up, and I said, listen, brother, this is getting a little too sticky for us. We might need to think about getting the hell out of here before nightfall. He just looked at me and said, I know. Let's give it 24 more hours, and then we're out of here. I'm going to kill as many of these things as I can. Now, Steve knew this wasn't a good move. I could see it in his eyes. He realized that we were in way too deep. And the bad thing about it is, he wasn't the one that was going to pay the price. I was. We spent the rest of the day preparing defenses. Ben cleared more trees to give us a better line of sight. Karate Kid dug out 2 small ditches within our perimeter and filled them with gasoline as a way of using fire to separate the creatures and provide us more light so we can see. And no one was allowed to venture out from the camp at all. And with good reason. I know I saw 2 of those creatures watching us. They were there for a split second, then gone. At this point in time, I didn't know if we were going to survive the night. But I knew one thing for sure. We were prepared to fight tooth and nail. Smoke bombs, flashbangs, fire traps. This was going to be one night to remember. And by the time darkness fell, the camp was transformed into a target range. Gone were the safari tents and fancy equipment. It was about to go down. There was no fancy meal cooked by a chef that night. Straight up MREs, pinto bean stew is what we had. Shit was awful. Looking back on it, that almost was my last supper. The mood was tense as darkness grew. Everyone knew that tonight was going to be hell. We had no idea what we were about to face. Unlike the night before, things were normal until about 11:30. That's when the woods went silent. It was amazing, almost as if every living creature evacuated the area. Vital signaled from high above us in the tree to let us know that he was seeing movement. The next thing you know, a freaking boulder comes flying in at us. Now listen, this is not a rock. Rocks are about the size of your hand. This thing was the size of my chest. This was a boulder. It was like God got pissed off at us and it started raining boulders from the sky. I remember looking around and thinking to myself, man, we're in serious trouble. They're going to stay out of shooting range and just throw boulders at us. Just then, Vital began to fire in the opposite direction from where the boulders were coming from. Then he said something that I'll never forget. "It's a distraction. Look behind you." By the time I turned around, Vital had begun to open fire full blast, and I could see huge shadows moving towards us. But it was not until Kid lit the first ring of fire that I realized what we were up against. Now I need you for a second to imagine this. As the first ring of fire began to ignite, one by one, the dark shadows surrounding us became clear. It looked like an army. This shit reminded me of something from the ancient days of the Roman Empire. They were all lined up. Some had boulders in their hands. Others had broken trees. I mean full-size trees. It had to be about 30 of these things. The smallest 7 feet tall. Some were male and others were female. Vital stopped shooting for a moment, and I swear it was like something out of a movie. From behind the line of creatures stands up this thing. I say it stood up because it had to be squatting down. This creature was 14 feet tall. Its hair illuminated this kind of reddish brown glow by the fire. And this was clearly their leader. Now, I'm not bullshitting you. He dwarfed the others as he moved forward to the front of the line. At this point, I'm thinking I'm about to die a horrible death. I could see it in my head, my arms being ripped off, my legs being ripped off, and being eaten alive. And if we had been led by anyone else, we probably would have died that night. I mean, you can feel the fear overwhelming each of us, just like a pitcher left under the faucet running water. And just when we were intimidated, I heard this shot, and I knew it was from him. Steve had just fired his .50 cal Barrett. I watched as the 14-foot tall Bigfoot was hit dead center in his chest. The creature stumbled backwards for a few steps, bumping into others, then fell on his side. Steve had shot the leader in hopes that the rest of them would become afraid. And for a moment, it looked like it had worked. Until the largest female looked down at their leader, pointed a finger at us, and began to roar. Steve's second shot put a stop to that instantly. I can't tell you exactly where he hit her, but she fell to the ground, squirming, arms and legs flailing about. From that point on, it was non-stop shooting. Chef and Ben popped smoke at our rear to keep them from coming up behind us, while Kid chucked flashbangs into the direction of the others. The sound didn't seem to bother them, but the flash definitely stunned them, allowing us to kill 10 to 15 of these things with ease. The tide had turned in our favor, and I had just thought, man, I might just survive this shit, when I felt the ground shaking beneath my feet. Turning to my left, there it was, moving full speed directly at me with its mouth wide open. It looked like one of those Down syndrome or retard kids we grew up with in school, except it was jet black. And his eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't set on the front of his head. They were kind of to the side. But the eyeballs actually rolled completely in as it fixed its gaze on me. I was only able to get off one shot before I went flying into the air. And just like on those cartoons where the Hulk throws something in the air and then punches it, well, that was me. And as my body was in mid-air, this thing took 2 steps forward, swung its forearm in a downward direction, striking my left thigh. I felt the bone break before I hit the ground. I was laying there in pain, and it was just about to step on me when Ben shot it in the head with that AA-12 shotgun. After the first shot, it was still able to turn and look at him. Then it fell to the ground. From my position on the ground, I fired as many shots as I could. Man, I watched as Charlie was hitting the head with one of those boulders, splitting his skull. Chef was hit by a tree. This thing came flying in like somebody threw a frisbee, knocking him unconscious. Right at about 4:45 in the morning, things went silent. I didn't know if they were preparing for round 2 or if they had enough. But with 3 of us down and limited munitions, it was time for us to get the fuck out of Dodge. Ben did his best to tend to my broken femur, and somehow Vital was able to wake Chef up. But Charles, he was gone. There was nothing that could be done for him. With a splint on my leg and some drugs in my system, I was able to stand with assistance. Now able to stand, I witnessed firsthand the carnage. blood, hair, everywhere. They didn't take their dead with them this time. They left them behind. To be honest with you, this was a massacre. And for the first time, I felt conflicted that day. I'm not sure if it was the drugs or my conscience, but I felt fucked up. We had wiped them out of existence. Or at least so I thought. Steve, ever focused, gave orders for us to start heading back to the boats. We were to leave everything behind except for our weapons and the remaining ammo. There was really nothing left. Everything had been destroyed that night. By the time we reached the river, the sun had fully risen. And again, the sense that we were going to make it out of this alive washed over me. I finally felt secure. That was until I started hearing this sound coming from behind us. It wasn't them coming for us. It was the sound of them weeping, moaning, almost as if they were crying for the loss of their family members. While all that was going on, Kid looked down at his GPS, confused. He said, "The boats are supposed to be here, but according to this, they're 30 feet deep in the river." Steve looked at me and said, "Wait, what? You mean these things sunk our boats?" And in that moment of confusion and fear, the meds wore off. The pain from my leg came rushing back, sending signals to my brain that said, "Bitch, you're hurt and you're in danger." Ben assisted me in sitting down on the ground and walked over to the riverbank. He just stared in the water as if he was Darth Vader and he could use the Force to get the boats back. And Steve, he just looked at me with this kind of blank stare on his face. Because at that moment, I think he finally realized we were screwed. While we were coming to this realization, all you heard was them screaming and crying in the background. This ordeal was far from over. We had limited ammo and now no transportation. An accurate assessment of our situation at this time would be to say that we are officially screwed. No transportation, low munitions, and we were miles away from the extraction point. In fact, there was no way to get there by foot. In retrospect, we should have left about 24 hours ago, and life would have been easy. Now, we're about to be hunted down like animals. As I sat there, I could feel the anguish and pain of these creatures. They were going to come and get us soon, and we needed to come up with a plan. For the first time ever, I looked into Steve's eyes and saw a level of fear as he paced back and forth along the riverbank with his head held high. I could see the gears in his head moving as he came up with a plan. Now, I already knew he had a plan to get us out of here. He was past that part, but he was worried about something. The pain in my leg was so severe that I started to feel dizzy. And the next thing you know, I blacked out. I was awakened by the feeling of water on my back. And when I opened my eyes, we were floating downriver on these makeshift rafts made of logs. Steve was there kneeling next to me. He propped me up on his backpack, looked me square in the eyes, smiled, and said, "Glad to have you back in the land of the living." "Where are we?" I asked. 3 miles downriver. When I looked around, Vitar was towards the front of our raft, with his weapon in hand scanning the wood lines. Just behind us, about 30 yards, was a second makeshift raft that carried Chef, Ben, and Kid. For a moment there, I was relieved to know that we all were headed downriver. That's when Steve handed me my weapon and said, "This is not over. They're shadowing us in the wood line. Stay ready." Still, there was something wrong. The look of fear was still there in his eyes. That's when I said, "Steve, tell me right now what's wrong." He and Vital both looked at me. "You don't remember the ride upriver?" My mind was flooded with the visuals of the trip upriver, and that's when I saw it. There's a section of this river where it narrows to only about 150 yards wide. Along that section, the riverbank slopes upward, and there's a rock face. This was a perfect point for them to attack us from. My next question was, how far downriver are we from that point, Steve? He just looked at me and said, I'm not sure, but I hope we get there before dark. We need to get there before it gets dark. Looking over towards the tree line, I could see movement. These things indeed were following us downriver. Now, when I say movement, I'm not just talking about one or two trees moving. You could see the trees swaying back and forth as if these things were walking in single file lines. We were definitely not out of danger, and everyone knew it. With the sun directly above my head, I knew I had a good 4 or 5 hours before the sun went down. So I rested, saving my strength for what was to come. The sound of the water was comforting in such a stressful situation. It made me think about Charlie. I didn't like him, but that was a horrible way to die. And for us to be forced to leave him was even worse. I'm sure he was being devoured by those beasts, his body torn apart limb by limb. It was one of the last things I remember before passing out again. That and the look of concern on Vital's face. The next time I was awoken was by the sound of gunfire. My vision was still foggy. My leg was in the most intense pain I'd ever felt in my life. But once I was able to focus, the situation looked bad. It was just about to turn dark, and we were in the middle of that 1 mile stretch where the river got most narrow. Vital was taking pot shots into the woods. Steve was kneeling holding his 50 cal, and the second raft somehow had got ahead of us. The terrain had changed, and the riverbank was only about 50 yards away. Beyond that was a rock face, and looking up, I could see them moving along above us. As I reached for my rifle, Steve pointed back upriver and said, "Keep your eyes on the water. Several of them have already jumped in the river. If anything moves, kill it." I hesitated for a second, thinking, what the fuck are they doing in the water? But it made sense. If we can swim, why can't they? Next came the boulders, splashing down into the water from that rock face. I'll never forget it. And what made everything worse was I was feeling extremely weak. But I knew if we planned to get the hell out of here alive, I needed to fight. So I rolled over to my right side, took aim, and fired a shot. Now, I wasn't thinking I was actually going to hit anything. This was just a way of me getting my adrenaline and endorphins going. But that's when I saw one jump off the rock face and into the trees. It was coming straight for us. I fired again, hitting it in the chest and then again in the shoulder. Its body and arms flung wildly as it continued to move forward and jumped into the river. Now we had one of these things in the water with us for sure, but I couldn't see it anywhere. On the raft ahead of us, they went from controlled bursts to full automatic fire and began throwing flashbangs on the riverbank. That's when I noticed the straps and vines used to hold our raft begin to bulge and move a bit, as if something was pushing the logs from beneath the water. Then the weight shifted as this massive hand gripped the front right edge of the raft, right where Vital was standing. Without hesitating, he shot the hand and emptied the clip into the water, right at his feet, the river filling with blood. The next thing I remember is this loud explosion of force, water splashing everywhere. The raft that Ben and Kid stood on was flipped over, tossing them into the water. Seconds later, I saw Ben's head pop up first. Then I saw Kid swimming towards our raft. And as Ben struggled to hold on to his weapon and grasp one of the tree logs, I noticed that Chef had not come up yet. From that point on, it was an all-out gunfight. Steve firing a 50 cal, Vital firing. Kid had climbed on our raft and started firing. The whole while, Ben was holding on to a log barely out of the water and shooting his weapon at the same time. Several minutes passed before Chef's body came floating back to the surface. When we were able to retrieve it, his neck had been broken. This firefight went on for the next 30 minutes. They had killed 2 of our team members. There was not going to be a third. We threw everything we had at them. I know that I personally killed another 5 of these creatures. And I saw Ben kill 3 more. And there's no telling how many that Steve killed with that 50 cal. 10 minutes later, everything went silent as the river widened and the creatures seemed to disappear. And during this expedition, we lost members of our little family. This was not the first time, but this was the worst exchange we'd ever been in. Steve looked down at me and smiled and said, "We made it out alive, brother. Now you need to rest." I remember him sticking me with a needle, and when I woke up, my leg was in a cast and we were on a plane. There's not much more to share outside of that. We went to kill a clan of Bigfoots. We were successful, but at what cost? It cost us the lives of our friends. We never been back to Alaska to hunt any other creature, and after that experience, we'll probably never set foot back in Alaska again. Long before we visited Ruby, Alaska, before the death, the blood, the stinging pain of loss, before it was revealed to us that the world was full of hideous monsters, and that the elites of the world knew of these creatures and used them to suit their needs, before we met Vital, Ben, and Chef, it was just Steve and I, two men who traveled the world, searching for a good time, aimlessly wandering without a purpose, having the time of our lives. So tonight, I take you back to the beginning. How it all started, when we first realized that the world is not what it seemed, and walk you through the events that turned us into what we are today, monster hunters. Hours, May 1st, 2004. Steve and I are in Belize having the time of our lives. Oceanfront resorts, great food, beautiful women. If you've never been to Belize, you need to put it on your bucket list. And the women, oh my God, amazing. With skin tones ranging from the Creole colors of New Orleans to the smooth, dark chocolate of South Africa. In those days, long before we learned about the evils of the world, Roger and I only cared about traveling. And I'll never forget that night. I was beachside with the most angelic being God ever created. What was her name again? Oh, yes. Alicia. How could I ever forget her? She had these eyes that peered into your soul. You know, if things had gone differently, I could have seen myself marrying a woman like her. Beautiful, intelligent, and from a family of means. Alicia. Yeah. Roger was a few feet down from me, drinking and entertaining a group of 3 women, running his usual mind control language patterns, talking about feelings and using words like imagine this, and presupposing that all 3 of them will be having sex tonight when his satellite phone rang. You know, sometimes I wish that he had never answered that phone call. I sit back and wonder how our lives would have been if he had just taken those women back to his room instead of taking that call. It was that very phone call that set us on the path to becoming monster hunters. The phone call was from a man named Sorkin. You see, Sorkin had his eyes on this gold-rich land outside of San Carlos, Venezuela. Locals there were pan-mining the area and selling lots of gold. And as for Sorkin, best way to describe him is a globalist. He had his hands in everything: drugs, guns, prostitution, diamonds, gold mines, oil. You name it, he had access to it. Countries didn't matter to him. In fact, borders didn't exist to him. And rules? Shit on rules. They didn't even apply to Sorkin. One day he told me Hugo Chavez was just a pissant dictator to him. You see, I'd only met him once before. Roger and I got an invite to hang out with him and his sons at their box suite at the Dallas Cowboy games. And I had never seen anything like this in my life. I mean, the power this guy had. Congressmen, diplomats, foreign ambassadors. Everywhere we went, somebody was kissing his ring. And somehow, Sorkin and Roger's dad were good friends. But looking back on everything, I don't even know how he fucking knew we were in Belize. From within 24 hours of that phone call, we go from drinking and partying to doing business. Sorkin's business. He makes us an offer, and a good one at that. Just for reaching the location and securing it, we would get 3% equity in the mines. Now, of course, with a man like Sorkin, 3% really means 2% or 1%, but we really didn't give a damn. It was an adventure, and we were adventurers. The following morning, Steve and I caught a flight from Belize to Caracas. Then, shit got a little shaky. We boarded an old 1981 Cessna plane for the most dangerous flying I have ever experienced in my life, hopping from city to city, from Caracas to San Fernando. And when we landed in San Fernando to get fuel, we damn near lost a wheel on the plane. Potholes all over the runway. After fixing the wheel and several other close calls, we landed in San Carlos de Negro. Now, not to be confused with San Carlos. San Carlos de Negro is a small city. It rests right upon the Rio Negro River. And the guy that Sorkin had put us in contact with in the area was named Juan. Now, I'm not going to tell you everything that Juan did, but I can tell you this much. San Carlos de Negro is on the border of Venezuela and Colombia. This guy does business with Sorkin and spends a lot of time in the jungles. Catch my drift? As far as San Carlos de Negros, the color of the city is a bit of an overstatement. This place was bare bones. A village is more like what I would call it. Stray dogs everywhere, poverty like nothing I'd ever seen. We jump in the back of the Jeep with Juan and his right-hand man, Dantes. Now, Juan really was nothing special to look at. Small man, weighed no more than 185 pounds and stood about 5'10". But Dantes, his boy, looked like he had been through a rough life. He's about 6'3", very slim, but he had the eyes of a killer. You know those cold, dead eyes? Soulless? And his head must have been split open like a melon at some point in time, because the scars on his face and the stitch job, man, imagine a skinny Latin version of Frankenstein with tattoos. And what was even more disturbing about Dantes was he didn't say a word the entire time. He was just there. We drove for what seemed like about an hour through the jungles. And then we arrived at this clearing. Had these fancy huts. Juan's operation was something major. Talking about 200 people in the middle of the jungle, moving around like work ants. Men, women, and children. We were set up in our own hut. 2 beds, table, chair. It was actually pretty nice. I lay down for a minute to take a nap, and Juan and Roger disappeared and went off somewhere. When I finally awoke, it was sundown, and a fire pit started everywhere. Roger was sitting there with Juan and Dantes, laughing and joking. Back in those days, he was way more charismatic, far from this obsessed personality that he has today. That's why they laid out the plans. We were to get up at first light, and Roger and Juan were going to fly over to Colombia to get supplies. Dantes and I were to take one of the large jeeps, 6 men, and head out to the area where locals were mining the gold. We would leave those 6 men there overnight to build huts and make preparations for us to arrive the next day. We spent the rest of the night sitting there drinking, laughing, and joking. And then the following morning, Roger and I parted ways, and I was left there to deal with Dantes. Turns out he was way more talkative than I would ever imagine. In fact, this dude talked the entire ride as we slowly maneuvered our way down this half-washed-out road headed to the location. He talked about his family, how his mother and father were murdered in a drug war with the Colombians. He bragged about being shot 10 times like he was Tupac and not dying. He told me about when he was hit in the head with a machete and how some of the workers rebelled against him and Juan. This man had been dealt some major shit in his lifetime, and he was only 32 years old. Now, I don't know if any of you guys ever spent time in the jungles. It's different from the woods of North America. It's hot, humid, the air is thin, and every breath is a struggle. You find yourself sweating profusely. And soon, I was taking off my shirt just like Dantes. Riding in the Jeep was the only positive thing about this trip. Just a little air circulating to cool me down. It was like having your own personal spot in hell. It was just that hot. And Dantes continued to surprise me. I didn't realize he was a hands-on kind of guy. When we hopped out of the Jeep, he grabs a chainsaw and begins to help clear the trees with the other guys. And within the first 3 hours, they had the first structure completely built. It was crude at first. Pretty much a small log structure, but they claimed by tomorrow, it would have a tile roof to protect us from the rains. This was something I had to see. While they worked, I ventured off a little to explore, carrying an AK-47 that Dantes gave me. He gave me a stern warning about the jaguars, telling me to keep my eyes up on the trees if I wanted to live. And then he told me to follow the sounds of the waterfall. and eventually I would find where gold was being mined by the people of the villages. After traveling about 300 feet through the dense jungle, I came across a trail. It's fairly worn, and up ahead, I could hear the sounds of people talking. I walked for a few more feet, and then the jungle brush opened up, and it was like I beheld paradise or something. Imagine the most beautiful landscape. To my left was this waterfall. Water flowed down, creating this vast pool, and then that pool flowed down into a small river where people were everywhere. It felt like I had stumbled upon the most beautiful ecosystem known to man. I had never seen anything like this except on postcards. The locals even waved and were very friendly. Further down the river, I could see men panning for gold. This was amazing. I stood there looking up at this waterfall, awestruck by its intense beauty. Then it hit me. This is where we were going to bring heavy equipment and mine for gold? We're going to fucking destroy this place. At that point in time, I was conflicted and so deep in thought that I hadn't even realized that Dantes walked up behind me until he said, "Beautiful, isn't it? It's been this way since I was a little boy. But come now, we must prepare to go. This place we must leave now and get back to our camp. I have a long ride ahead of us and need to be away from here before dark." Dantes stared attentively at the waterfall as he said this, and for a brief moment, I saw a look of concern on his face. But in those days, I was completely ignorant and naive to the dangers of the night. But looking back on that moment, if I knew then what I know now, I would have suspected something. We walked 300 feet or so back to the jungle to the area where we had parked the truck, hopped in and prepared to depart. But another strange sign was the workers. Now I understand these guys didn't have much of a choice. They were working for a drug cartel, so they did what they were told to do. But they had this look on their face. Not a look of fear, but a look of helplessness. Like they didn't want to stay there all night, but they had no choice. In reality, they didn't. And they stood there and watched us as we drove away with these blank looks on their faces. Almost like they were coming to terms with the fact that they were going to have to stay there the whole night. Although I was able to observe these things, I wouldn't understand the significance of it till the very next morning when we returned. When Dantes and I arrived back at the base camp, Roger and Juan were sitting at a makeshift table eating what looked like chicken. However, something was off with Roger. He had this look in his eyes. I had seen it before. It's not fear, but he looked uncomfortable. When he saw me walking up, he stood up from the table, smiled at Juan, and placed his hand on his shoulder walking by, and said, "I'll be back, my friend." Now you have to understand something about Roger. He and I have been together for a long time. His body language is very familiar to me. So familiar that I knew when he touched Juan on the shoulder, it was not meant to comfort Juan. It was a reminder to him that he needed to keep his wits about himself. Roger was now manipulating Juan. Something had gone down. Something really important. Because he hadn't done this the prior night. We shook hands and returned to our hut. Once inside, Roger closed the door, looked at me, and began to whisper, saying, "This motherfucker Juan is a goddamn psychopath. Listen, we flew into Colombia to get ammo and heavy weapons. He's going to kill every villager that's been mining the gold." I called Sorkin. He told me it's up to us how we handle it. He normally lets Juan make decisions, but we're in complete control right now. Now, Roger was the wrong person to put in this situation. Long before the term bullying was a thing, Roger hated people that abused power, and Juan was turning out to be the epitome of what he hated. "What are we going to do?" I asked. "We're in the middle of the jungle, and it's his territory. It's his decision to make, Roger. Sorkin is not here. We are. And I'm not taking a bullet in my ass over some fucking strangers, Roger." Just then we both heard a twig break outside the front door. Then a knock. It was Dantes. "Steve, we must talk." Dantes had been told about Juan's plan and didn't like it either. He's not a man to kill innocent people. And looking back, at this moment in time, is when I learned how ruthless Roger could be given the right circumstances. See, there are different types of people in this world. But it all boils down to two things. People who sit back and watch things happen, and those who actually make them happen. Roger went on to explain to Dantes that Sorkin told him that we were now in charge and we were calling the shots. And then he started to try and brainwash Dantes, questioning him, saying, "How long have you been working under Juan? Since you were in what, your 20s? What has that gotten you? How much longer do you think he'll keep you around?" Dantes surprised me when he looked at Roger and said, "There's no need for manipulation. I want to make a deal with you. I will kill Juan, but I want control of the drugs. You can have the gold. The villagers have to stay safe and they help us work the gold mine. We build roads, real houses, and get them electricity. If you can do that, I will kill Juan right now." Without hesitation, Roger said yes. And although I had spent the whole day with Dantes, his disdain for Juan was something that I missed. Somehow Roger saw it or picked up on it. I don't know, maybe Roger picked up on something during the flight to Colombia, but he knew it. When Dantes walked out, I whispered, "What if this is all a setup, a double cross to see if we're here to take over?" That's when Roger smiled, looked at me and said, "It's not. Everyone wants to be the boss. Dantes now has his opportunity. He will take it, and he will take it fast. Besides, Steve, you don't understand. Juan is a major piece of shit. He's a pedophile. He talked about it the whole time we were in the plane. I damn near shot him myself." I took a deep breath, and as we walked out of the hut, the night air was so humid. No breeze. But this moment felt big. I mean colossal. This is the moment when we made the transition from two guys who traveled the world fucking off and stepped into the shrewd world of doing global business. And although the decision we made was to help the innocent people of the area, we had just initiated a hostile takeover, major drug operation. This all was a bit much for me, and I couldn't help but hold my head down as we walked out of the front door. Juan was still sitting at the table when we arrived. By now, he was half drunk. Dantes sat there quietly next to him as Roger and I took a seat. Roger squared his shoulders and smiled. "Juan, you think we can talk about those villagers again in the morning? Maybe we can revisit the idea when you haven't been drinking." That's when Juan quickly stood to his feet, stumbling a bit and resting his hand on the table and said, "Roger, you are a boy. Sorkin told me, you play around the world with daddy's money, but have no money of your own. I'm a man. I built this drug operation myself. I'm a man, boy. Stay out of my way and let men do what they must do." A quick glance was all it took from Roger to Dantes, and then the sound of a single gunshot echoed through the jungle. It's not like in the movies, where the blood splatters all over the wall and a person just falls. Nah, Dantes shot him from a seated position. The bullet exploded his face. Juan's eyeball flew out on the table. He was able to turn and look at Dantes just before he fell to the ground. Half of his face was missing. I can only imagine how surprised he was when he realized that Dantes shot him. Beyond the eyeball sitting on the table and Juan's face literally being blown apart, what got me was how casual Dante was after he did it. Men came running with rifles, and upon discovering that Juan was dead, they smiled and laughed. He truly was a pedophile, molesting the children of the villagers. And Dantes was respected among the men as a fighter. He worked with them and toiled with them. He was one of them. And now he was in charge. This whole situation was a lot to process. It was my first time seeing a man get shot. I didn't want to show weakness, but I felt sick. The smell of blood was strong, and his eyeball sitting on the table. Oh. I got up and walked away. Made it about 20 feet before I vomited. Roger, on the other hand, seemed unfazed by the events. He got up, shook Dante's hand, and walked into our hut. After I gathered myself, I walked in, wiping my mouth, and said, "Did we do the right thing?" Roger's reply was, "We did the only thing we could do. Now we have control of the situation and the respect of the people. Let's give it a few days. The word will spread and we'll be the heroes." Somehow, Roger was able to go to sleep that night, but I wasn't. In my mind, I kept replaying Juan getting shot in the face over and over and over again. And the following morning, I was still awake when Dantes knocked on the door to our hut. "Wake up. It's time we go back. The men should be done by now." And when I walked out of the hut and past the table from last night, I could still smell the blood. Juan's body was gone, and in the distance there was smoke from a fire. I never took the time to ask, but it's safe to assume that they burned his body. Meanwhile, Dantes gathered 20 more men, weapons, fuel, lanterns, flashlights, all kinds of crap, and we headed out in a caravan towards the site. During the ride, I tried to tell Roger about the beauty of this location, how majestic it was, and that we were going to destroy the place. But at that moment, Roger had begun to transform into the man that he is today, cold-hearted and slightly disconnected. After an hour ride through the jungle, we arrived at the site where the men were supposed to be building huts, but no one was there. Only 3 huts had been built. No fires had been started. No food had been cooked. It was almost as if these guys disappeared. And Dante's reaction was pretty insightful. He seemed completely unsurprised by the situation. The rest of the men, they kneeled on the ground making the sign of the cross and began to pray. And they whispered among themselves this term. What was it? Los alados. Dantes instructed the men to look around for them and check the trees. The trees? Roger said, looking at me. You see, we had no clue what we gotten ourselves into, but we would soon find out. Thinking that the men had just wandered off, Roger and I proceeded to head towards the falls. We traveled the 300 feet or so to the trail, and when he first saw it, I think he realized what I was telling him. The village people were downriver at work, so we headed that way to talk to them. How much gold can you find here in a day's time? Roger asked. Would you like to make more? The funny thing is, most Americans like us, we believe that people in third world countries are ignorant and uneducated. And in some cases, that's true. But in matters of money and value, these people knew exactly what they had. They just had no way of getting to more of it, and had no one to sell it to other than the drug cartels for food and clothes. I asked them if they knew what happened to the men that we left there yesterday, and it was weird. Prior to me asking that question, they were all smiles, then complete silence. The older men began to walk away, but standing right behind that group of older men was a teenage girl. She smiled and signaled for me to come over. That's when she told me she heard about Senor Juan, and it was good that he was gone. He had long been taking advantage of the girls in the area. This young girl was the first to explain to us the true danger of this beautiful paradise that we had found. She said that ever since she was 8 years old, no one in any of the villages would venture out at night. She said that everyone feared Los Alados, or the winged ones. These creatures would emerge from the caves behind the waterfalls at night. According to her, she had never seen one herself, but she heard that they were women with wings. Their eyes glowed this green color at night, and that they would take anyone outside near the falls at night. She said last night, they heard screams as soon as the sun went down, and that our men had probably been taken to the caves behind the falls. Roger and I thought that this was complete bullshit. Legends that people tell kids to keep them out of the jungles at night. We figured it was a local's way of keeping their kids from being eaten by jaguars or bitten by snakes. However, the look on this girl's face was one of sheer terror, and she was afraid of something. We traveled back, finding Dantes and the rest of the men. They had begun to build these weird structures. They had dug holes in the ground and jammed logs into them. And on the opposite end, they had sharpened them to these very, very fine points. The best way to describe it is take your hands, spread your fingers, and point your palms to each other. Then with your hands straight, interlace your fingers between each other, making a triangle. Your fingertips will be where the logs were sharpened to these extremely sharp points. And that was the structures that we were going to stay in. While some of the men were at work, Dantes pulled us to the side and said, "Hey, we need to search the cave behind the waterfalls before dark." He said they found some of the men's torn and bloody clothing on a small cliff just before you reach the falls. What the teenage girl from the village said was starting to make sense. Roger and I looked at each other like, what the fuck is going on? I said, "Hey, let's call Sorkin." So Roger and I went to the Jeep, closed the doors, and placed the call. No answer. "You think it's possible that something like that could be out there?" asked Roger. "All I could say is anything's possible, my friend." Based on all the evidence that was stacking up in front of us, indeed it looked like it was. Luckily for us, the pedophile Juan had got a mini arsenal, shotguns, AK-47s, flashlights, claymores, all kinds of crap. Back in those days, I had no idea how to use any of those weapons. Shit, I barely knew how to change a magazine on AK-47. So I grabbed a shotgun and a flashlight. And Roger took a 9mm sidearm and an AK-47. I never forget the day. 1345, May 5th. The day that would change our lives forever. Dante has gathered 12 men, accompanied by myself and Roger. We ventured up into the area near the falls. Climbed to the cave, steep, wet, and very slippery. There was no way that our men had traveled this route in the dark. It was nearly impossible to do by daylight. So I began to question, how did the clothes actually end up there? When we reached the top, it was again some of the most beautiful scenery I had ever seen. The cave opening was straight ahead, leading into the rocks beyond the waterfall itself. Now the stench of death couldn't be detected outside of the cave. It was masked by the scent of fresh water cascading down. But upon entering the cave, my nose was assaulted by the smell of rotten meat, blood, and feces. A smell so strong that it made my eyes burn and my nose twitch. Dantes bravely led the way deeper into this cave. And when we got about 50 feet in, it split into two different sections. One that sloped upward and to the left, and the other one straight ahead. Roger and I, along with 3 men, went left, and Dantes took the rest of the men and went right. It didn't take us very long to realize that we weren't alone in these caves. We had this constant feeling of being watched. You know, like something was just in front of you in the darkness, and it was reaching out for you, toying with you, like it could get you at any moment. That's exactly how it felt, and I can't think of any other way of describing it. You knew you were in danger, and not in danger of a rock hitting you in the head. I'm talking about danger of something taking you and eating you. We had been moving forward through the darkness for about 20 minutes when the air suddenly became fresh. It was this draft blowing, and steps ahead of us in the cave, and a few steps ahead, the cave opened up into this huge cavern. Our lights barely penetrated the darkness, and when Roger lit a flare, the place was massive. When I looked down, we were walking towards the end of a ledge. It dropped straight down. If we had taken just another 20 steps, we'd have all died. At that point, we hadn't heard anything out of the normal. Just the sounds of water dripping and the echo of our own footsteps. But when one of the men lit a flare and tossed it over the edge, something happened. We started to hear this noise, kind of screeching and crackling at first, then flapping of wings. Now, this was no hallucination. These sounds were real. They were coming from above us and below us. I shined the flashlight upwards trying to see what it was, and that's when I caught a glimpse of what looked like a giant wing. By giant, I mean leathery and long, 7 feet, I would guess. Gotta go back. I began to pull Roger as I slid past the other 2 guys, trying to get back into the tunnel. I was pulling Roger so hard that the shirt began to rip, and when I looked back, that was the first time I saw one of them. Imagine a naked woman with wings. I had turned around just in time to witness this creature knock one of the men off the ledge. Then the other guys came running towards us as Roger and I began to panic, rushing through the darkness of the tunnel, and I dropped my weapon. Fear had completely taken over me. I struggled to breathe. And as we ran, I began to hear gunfire and screams. After about 10 minutes of stumbling around in the darkness, I could finally see the light and begin to hear the sounds of the waterfalls. When we got to the entrance of the cave, there was no sign of Dantes and his men. Luckily, one of the other men who was with us, a man named Alejandro, found a shell casing on the floor near the entrance. He told us that he believed that they had left us behind and we needed to go outside. And when we emerged from the cave, Alejandro was right. I could see Dantes and another man quickly heading towards the bottom of the falls. "What the fuck was that?" said Roger. And Alejandro, with this cryptic voice, says, "Those were the winged ones. And now that we disturbed them, they will come for us all." We rushed down the side of the falls, and when we got back to camp, Dantes was frantically moving around barking orders. He had already called 75 more men from his operation to come to this camp, and it took about 30 minutes to get him to explain to us what happened. Dantes said that they found themselves at the bottom of the same cavern that we were in, that he saw the flare we tossed down falling from the air, and the floor was riddled with carcasses of dead animals. But it wasn't until they found the dead bodies of the missing men that they really began to panic. These men, their chests and stomachs had been ripped open. Their hearts, lungs, and organs were all gone. Then they heard the wings and the screeching. Dante says that when he turned to lead them out, a winged woman was standing right behind one of his men. She engulfed him with her wings, and he heard his bones crackling, saw the blood leaking from his body. That's when he all opened fire. One by one, his men were killed or just taken and flown off into the darkness. That's when he ran. Only him and one other man escaped. We were dealing with something that Roger and I had not anticipated. But naked women with wings? And on top of that, we only had a few hours till sundown. I went and sat down inside our hut just trying to clear my head. But there was this constant movement and panic outside. And when the rest of the men arrived, they came with generators and lights. Roger and I didn't say much to each other in the hours leading up to sundown. We knew if we wanted to maintain control of this mine, we'd have to stand with Dantes and his men and deal with whatever came that night. So when the sun began to go down, Roger and I stood among the men and waited. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Then at 10 p.m., the treetops began to sway and move, but there was no breeze blowing. There had been none the entire day. Then it sounded just like thunder. Everywhere you looked were these creatures. Their eyes glowed these green colors from the lights. The men began to fire randomly as the winged ones swooped down from the sky. I was standing right next to Roger when one of them flew over us. Massive wings, and without any effort, it bludgeoned one of the men in the head. Upon witnessing this, the situation became so real to me that I began to open fire myself. These creatures weren't invincible. In fact, shooting their wings sent them crashing to the ground. This fight went on through the entire night. And when the sun rose and we did a head count, we were down 22 men, and there were 15 dead creatures. And when Roger and I finally got a chance to take a closer look, they looked just like women. I mean, every female feature was exactly the same. The skin was pale though, and it turned red in the sunlight, as if they were getting severe sunburn. I would have expected them to have sharp teeth like some kind of vampires from a movie, but they didn't. They had one row of teeth. But when we measured these things, this tallest one would have stood 10 feet tall, and the smaller ones 7 feet, and their wingspans ranged from 12 to 19 feet. Dantes rounded up the bodies and burned them, then sent men into the caves with explosives to seal off the entrances. The following day, we were finally able to get Sorkin on the phone. We told him about these creatures and how we had to kill them to secure the location. That's when Sorkin said, "Oh yes, Los Alados, the women of the caves. If you took care of them, then we have a secure location." Fuck. Sorkin knew about these creatures. Not only did he know about them, he knew they were there the whole time. I didn't know whether to feel played or pissed. He used us. Roger began to negotiate with Sorkin. He told him, "We secured the land, killed the monsters, and now we want 35% of all the revenues. If not, we'll just buy and move the equipment in here ourselves and keep 100%. And he told Sorkin, "You can consider the 32% a bonus for almost getting us killed." By the end of the day, they had agreed to 22%. And Roger cut a custodial deal with Dantes for 2%, just so he can keep an eye on the place and make sure the winged ones didn't come back. After that, we left and returned to the States. So now you know how we got started in this life of hunting monsters. But it's absolutely nothing like what you see on TV. Sometimes I wish it was. I can assure you that reality is far worse than fiction.